Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to our Conversations program today. My name's Emily Butler. I'm the Conversations Manager. We're delighted to be hosting a conversation this afternoon that's looking at the question of reinventing the institution, a question that's gained a lot in prescience over the past 18 months. And we're delighted that we've got an exceptional lineup of newly appointed museum directors to look at this. We're joined today by Johanna Burton, who's the director of the MOCA LA, Isolde Brielmaier, who's the deputy director of the New Museum in New York, and Alison, who's the director of the ICA in San Francisco, a newly established institution. And to help us navigate this interesting topic is Andres Janto, who's an advisor on cultural strategy and an author of The Future of the Museum, which came out this year. So just before I hand over, one small word of housekeeping. Please make sure that you keep your mask on throughout the conversation. We'll be passing a mic around at the end, so there's a chance to ask questions. Please keep your mask on if you're speaking into the mic. So without further ado, please give a very warm round of applause and welcome to our speakers and enjoy the conversation.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be back. Also saying hello to the online audience and posterity, because everything here is archived and ends up in the same place called the internet. And thank you, Emily, and thank you, Ed, and thank you, the camera people, and everybody else who is making this possible, and to Art Basel for keeping this tradition alive, a little bit of intellectual entertainment around the edges of this intense experience that we're having. So I don't know if you've noticed, we've had a bit of a complicated last couple of years, and probably few institutions have experienced as many seismic shocks as museums. There's been the health emergency of the pandemic, which caused institutions to immediately snap to a new way of operating. There was the economic fallout after the closures. Massive lost revenues in many institutions. And then, of course, if you remember back to last summer, which ushered in a reckoning over systemic inequity and racial injustice, which really has rocked museums, their commitment to their communities, their hiring practices, many, many aspects, which we'll talk about today. Amidst all this, there was a kind of a troubling sign that was, I think, hard for us to digest, which was that museums were not considered essential in most places of the world. So Target was open, museums were closed. That was a hard pill to swallow, I think, for institutions that believed that they were essential to their communities. And a sort of a deep anxiety has pervaded the field and the discussion around it about what is the place of the museum in the larger social fabric. So amidst all this, there's also good news, and that is that these reckonings and these challenges have also accelerated the evolution of institutions, and changes that were already really being discussed, I would say, sort of leapfrogged ahead, and so did new faces, frankly. There's been a strong generational shift during this time, many, many new appointments, and more coming. And so we're very, very happy to have three of these leaders here with us today. And they are going to speak very candidly, and for that they need another round of applause. So please, thank you. So, newsflash, this is not an easy job. A record number of museum director jobs are open, I think more than 14, as it was recently reported, and more opening up soon. And no wonder, museums are at a crossroads. And we'll hear more about this, but just so that the laundry list, they need to rethink their programming and collecting approaches. Their costs are going up. It hasn't become easier or less expensive to operate a museum. Society is asking more and more of museums. It's expensive to deliver those things. Many museums have sort of tapped out their earned income generating resources. Private donors are often gravitating elsewhere, although I should mention the Met just announced $125 million yesterday. Government funding is elusive. This is something our European friends feel as a bigger burden. Here, it was never there to begin with, although I should mention the Brooklyn Museum just got $50 million from New York City. Museums have to rethink their internal staffing and culture, their governance, technology, obviously. And there has been, to a degree that the public perhaps doesn't always perceive, a great deal of turmoil behind the scenes as well, which we'll get to. So it's not a job for the faint of heart, but we have three very brave people here with us today, and it's a moment certainly of challenge, but also a moment of reinvention, a moment of reassertion of why this institution, which is still a relatively young kind of institution, why it's important and how we could sort of reassert its relevance on new terms. So I want us to survey this horizon of opportunity. What I'm going to do is pull each of you in, and I'm very curious what made you be interested to be a museum leader, given that it's not a super easy job, and how you're working with your respective institutions to sort of meet this moment. And Johanna, I want to start with you, because maybe you've had the most crazy year in some ways out of all of us, not because of your institution. You just arrived, really, at MOCA in LA, but you started your year at the Wexner, and then we knew you were coming to MOCA, but all of a sudden you're fully in charge. So I want to, after these sort of cinematic events, and as you get your sea legs there, what made you be interested in taking on this kind of role, and how do you, what's your main focus as you move into this new challenge?
Hi, everybody. It's really nice to see you. Andres, thank you for inviting me. And I just want to acknowledge my amazing two pals on stage who I admire a great deal. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about how important support in the field is, but I would just start by saying these are two people who I count as part of the support network, so thank you. And thank you, Ed. And I think you're Ed. I like to thank people, even if I don't know them, so thank you. How did I get started, or why did I want to do this job? I think what I learned it's funny in a way to be called a new leader, because I feel that I've held kind of quiet leadership positions for most of my career. That's the shift for me, is recognizing that there is a certain kind of public-facing element to assuming the helm, which I enjoy, but I also think, if done really well, can also be a kind of quiet leadership position, which may be a new shift a little bit. I often talk about the legacies of service leadership, to which I continue to aspire. So in a funny way, this is not at all where I thought I was going. I was trained as an art historian. I realized I really wanted to work with artists. I became a critic. And so constantly what I liked to do was make frameworks that other people could successfully inhabit. And those frameworks just got bigger and bigger. So that was the frame of the essay, or the frame of the curatorial platform, or the frame of a department. Now it's the frame of a museum. And we'll talk about this later, but I will say I also believe a lot in institutions. Maybe that's something we can talk about as well. It's a moment to question them deeply, but I think to invest in them deeply as well. So I think that's how I ended up here.
Well, there's a very important piece you left out, which is you had a really important part of your career rooted in education. And I think you're one of few museum directors I can think of who came out through that trajectory. And I just want to quickly ask you to reflect on how that colors your perspective.
I think we are the sort of the crew that is going to emerge, actually, in this next moment. There are a number of directors of education, or people who have been engaged in education in really experimental ways, who are heading up major museums, and I think that's a shift. So or care about education. In fact, Isolde and I worked together on the education committee at the new museum. Well, we overlapped there. I got into education not because I got a degree in museum education, but rather because I understood education to be one of the central tenets of what museums do, and not just educating outwards, but asking museums to educate themselves internally. We call that engagement now. There are other terms for this. Actually, I think the last 2 years have shown just how vital that is. But education was always seen as the thing over there that explained the main event. And I think the shift has become understanding that education is centralized. I was lucky to work in institutions like the New Museum, where education was not seen as a sort of separate supplement, but part of the programmatic tenor. And the last thing I'll say is, again, I was a scholar. I am a scholar. But then I worked in these really weird hybrid educational forums that were the Whitney Independent Study Program. I ran the Bard Curatorial Program, and it allowed for these kind of laboratory moments that I continue to think of as really central to museums.
First soundbite of the day, lab moment. I think we want more laboratory moments. Isolde. Isolde Brielmaier is a classic New York low achiever in that she was already a professor at NYU's Tisch School and a curator for ICP and a trustee at the New Museum when she agreed to step into the role of deputy director. And importantly, though, you also spend time on sort of the other side of the art world fence at Westfield at the World Trade Center, where you did an enormous amount of programming, but in a different kind of context. So why the ambition to step into this sort of role, and where do you see the big priority for you in this rethink of the museum?
Great. Thank you so much, Andras, for inviting me, and to Art Basel for having me, Ed, thank you, and Emily for all your patience with my coordinating emails. I mean, there's so much overlap as well. I have to start off by saying that I actually don't think the landscape is that grim. I live in, or at least I try to live in, a state of consummate optimism, and I hold on to my joy, dare I say black joy, very, very tightly. And so that's sort of kind of the lens through which I'm approaching all of this, and I would not call myself brave, but rather very, very committed. And I think I've been sort of planted here for a reason, and when this opportunity came up, I felt I know the significance of it. I know, in particular, as a black woman, what it means to have an opportunity to lead, to vision. And I'm just deeply, deeply committed to the power of art and the power of ideas and to the existence and life of artists. And for that matter, when the opportunity came up, it was a lot of back and forth and thinking. But I just decided to sort of seize it. I think similarly, like Johanna, I'm a bit of, and I don't even know if I've called myself that, or Andras, I know you and I have had conversations. If other people have called me a bit of a polymath, right? So I have worked, I do have a PhD in art history and have sort of gone the scholarly route, somewhat ambivalently. But I have worked in a range of different capacities. So to your point, worked in museums, but also in the private sector, and also very much independently on different collaborations, whether they're with museums or whether they're with, private/corporate entities. I do all of that, but always centering artists in everything that I do. And I find when you center artists in everything you do, somehow things sort of come together in a really substantive, sort of more meaningful way. So when I looked at this role, and, I don't know how much specifically I'm going to speak about the New Museum. I've been on board now for almost 3 months, having stepped off the board as a trustee. So I'm really in a position right now where I'm listening and learning and definitely observing how the sausage is made, for better or worse. But one of the things that I can really say is that it is going to take polymaths, right? It's going to take people with a broad range of experience to tackle these jobs and to move museums, institutions. And I would say just, talking to people in other sectors, whether it's tech, medicine, automotive, telecom, everybody is at a crossroads. And it's going to really take some creativity to think about how we move forward. So that's sort of, one piece of it. I think there are a couple of things too. I think that we are having in the context of institutions, a little bit of a crisis of image, and I'm not talking about the issues around representation, which I'm sure we'll get to, and those are deeply, deeply important to me, but we're kind of having a PR crisis, like a little bit of a profile crisis. how we exist in the world, how we view ourselves, but I think also more importantly, how we're viewed by others, how we're viewed not only by our existing audiences, our core audiences, but also our aspirational audiences. And as you know, Andras, and probably Johanna knows this too, audience for me is everything. Artists make work to be seen and engaged, not to shove in the back of a closet. So it is my job it was my job as a curator, and I think also collaborating now with the teams at the new museum to figure out how many different points of entry we can create to artists' work and to the institution to allow for as many diverse people to come through and engage and also sort of share their ideas and voices. So there's this sort of crisis of institution for me, and I'm really glad actually that this panel was sort of posed as a question, so that way we can all sort of brainstorm together. Because I thought if it was a statement, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to draw a blank.
It's the world's most intentional question mark.
Exactly. But yeah, so I'm really interested in thinking about how we move forward, thinking about our profile as institutions. And then just a couple of other points that are really top of mind for me. Really interested in how to bring back or bring about a culture of care in museums. And I think it starts at home. I think we need to clean up our corners, our own corners. And so for me, that means, and all of you know this, you can actually work at a very high level and do so with joy. And so every day I come to work and I'm like, oh yeah, we need to put some joy in here because these meetings are killer, right? They don't need to be longer than 30 minutes and we need to have joy while doing it. So that starts at home, and that starts with I don't say staff, but the teams, right? What is it that they need? How as a leader, can I partner with them to create a different kind of workplace? And we're all talking about hybrid workspaces, but there's so much more to that, right? And we'll touch on DEIA, I think, and all of that. And then, so that's one piece, this sort of culture of care, because I think when you can do that behind the scenes, it really trickles out, and your audience, your visitors feel that. And then the other piece is really thinking a lot about leadership. And this is where I'm leaning very heavily into a lot of the discussions that are happening outside of the culture sector, right? In other sectors where they really are talking about different kinds of leadership and visioning at a very kind of innovative and high level. So really thinking about how do we vision, how do we lead in collaborative, in intentional, in inclusive ways. And then audience, of course, which we'll get to. But those are really sort of top of mind for me right now.
And we will get to the audience and to leadership. But before we move on, in the joyful spirit, but also as a straight talker, give us the one sentence definition of why we have a bad reputation.
Well, I think, first of all, I can't do anything in one sentence, Andras. But also, it depends on who you talk to.
But
and there's no one size fits all. I mean, the three of us are coming from three very, very different institutions. If you talk to artists, they're going to tell you one thing, right?
But what do you think is the main thing?
You may have to circle back to me on that. It's really hard to kind of distill it down to one thing. But
we have a reputation gap, a perception gap in this field. So
well, you know what, Andras, I will say, I think there still is the perception, and maybe, artists, I'm going to move them off center for a minute, just as we exist in the world, where we're still somewhat impenetrable. And there still is a sense of kind of elitism and a sense of kind of talking amongst ourselves, I think, in a way, right? And that's not to minimize all of the work that we've all done.
I think I wanted you to say that because
you did.
For many reasons, but partly because it sets up Ali so well. Because Ali has this wonderful opportunity in San Francisco to not be working in a legacy institution, but to go straight to 2.0. So thank you for the setup.
Thank you.
And so, because I was very lucky. I was in San Francisco a few weeks ago, and I saw your amazing everybody should make plans to go to San Francisco to see this new ICA in San Francisco that you're building in this gorgeous warehouse, which you can say a few words about, but you are in this enviable position of not having to undo, but to sort of invent into this moment. And you bring a lot of experience to that from SF MoMA, Smart Museum, and many other places, and everybody here writes and speaks and thinks big thoughts. But again, why take on the role? And given that you're sort of writing your own history, what are you focusing on?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, and thank you to these incredible colleagues on stage, and thanks to Art Basel and to all of you for spending some time here, and thanks for saying the word enviable, because I will say doing a startup museum, which is truly what the ICA San Francisco is, and what a crazy thing to imagine a startup museum, and we'll talk a little bit about how that came to be, but I want to say that I am loving the idea that we're turning into a moment of hopefulness, and that this panel can speak to a moment of hopefulness, because yes, of course, there's a moment of crisis in the world, in the cultural sector, in museums specifically, in the art world. The term impenetrable is a great one and does set up for much of what the ICA San Francisco is aiming to sort of begin to dismantle and undo. I was going to turn to the word relevance. I think there's an issue of relevance that is part of the PR crisis, or the real crisis for museums. I also want to just do a little shout out, maybe embarrassing, to Ann Elgood and Jeffrey Gibson, and the ICA LA director, and Jeffrey, who's an inaugural ICA San Francisco artist, and for the panel before us. But I think part of the reason I feel so hopeful in this moment is that being here amongst colleagues and audiences and artists and people who are aspirational institutions for ICA San Francisco, colleagues that I rely on to help think through these things, artists who I turn to create platforms. These are the reasons that I did decide to take on and continue this path that I've been doing for 20 plus years of, like my colleagues on this stage, starting as a scholar, believing in art history as my lens through which to understand the world that led up to the moment I live in, and my lens through which to examine the reality that is around me, both near and far. And it's always been artists that have helped me process what's happening. And this career that I happened upon, for me, a very traditional, I would say, in the art world, curatorial path to museum leadership. And the shift into leadership happened a bit accidentally for me, where it just sort of happenstance and, frankly, an illness of a museum director led me to step into an interim museum leadership role and realize, oh my goodness, this curatorial platform that allowed me to kind of share what was really meaningful for me, to give artists an opportunity to share this work that is, as you said so rightly, made to be impactful to a broad public. That was a really exciting thing. And then to be able to then see the holistic possibilities to lift a team up in a museum, to engage audiences, to help artists make connections in different ways, that became really exciting. There's a whole business side to it as well that you don't learn about in your PhD program in art history that becomes a challenge, and those are some of the things that are hard. Yeah, so very quickly, in San Francisco, we have this incredible opportunity that we can talk about how it happened, but essentially out of 2020 and 2021, out of the pandemic and the racial reckonings that we've talked about globally, but also very specifically in San Francisco, the crisis of economic disparities that we see across the world, but that have really been brought to bear for many ways, specifically in that region. There is this moment of figuring out, what is this city going to be? What is the cultural reality going to be? What is the possibility for Bay Area artists who have, for many years, there has been this kind of reality that it's just too expensive of a city to live in, that people are leaving. There are so many incredible thinkers, collectors, creatives who came together and said, there seems to be some room in this ecosystem for the addition of a non-collecting contemporary arts institution that is born out of this moment. And what would it look like to create an institution from scratch that, baked into its DNA, had some of these values, ideals, intentions that many of us have been talking about for years and have been working to build for years. But what if you didn't have to be a change agent? And what if you didn't have to work kind of within a construct? And what if you could kind of take these ideas and see if you put staff and artists, or team, I like that actually much better. I've been trying to undo that word.
And the four dogs in your office.
And the 4 dogs in our office, and bring joy to work with you every day. And what if you tried to see if nimbleness and those values and putting people around the table and saying, let's check each other at every turn. Could you move a little fast and see if you can work in a model that all of us are trying to do at the same time?
And I like that you landed on fast, because first of all, they're going to be open. They're going to start doing stuff in January,
right,
although it's a construction site. But I think speed is actually a really important issue. Like, life is moving quickly. Can we move fast enough along with it? Hard for museums to do. But before we move on, I mean, when you bring in all these people, is there one phrase or word or sort of your North Star that you tell them about what you want this to be, that sort of brings together this aspiration?
I think we use the word nimble a lot. I think all of us like this word nimble. I think the word responsiveness, I was just talking about that in the green room. This idea of relevance, responsiveness, being, no, there's not one word. I can't do one word, just like Isolde. But narrowing this space, the space between art and life getting narrowed, I think feels important.
Right. Well, we've heard a lot already. We've heard about belief in institutions, and I'm so happy all the joy on this panel. I think a year ago it would have been harder to be like maybe we're ready for joy. So equity, obviously, structures of care, cultures of care. We've heard about audiences already, infrastructure. So I want to sort of go deeper in that, and I want to circle back a little bit to that perception gap issue, because obviously museums are not the only institutions that are currently experiencing a kind of legitimacy crisis. But it seems as though we're having a particularly bad case of that. So I'm curious whether you feel that all the difficulties museums are having are just part and parcel of what it means to be an institution today, or are in fact museums having a harder go at this, and if so, why?
Would you like me to start, or does it matter?
I mean, not everybody has to say, but whoever feels most motivated.
I mean, I guess I'd say it's both. Yeah. I think we live now happily in a culture where people ask questions about their own conditions, and that we have set them up to ask those questions. I do think museums will have a harder time because they've been set up in such a way that the class-based, race-based, gender-based priorities that were invisible are now visible. So there is a kind of corrective that has to happen. But also that's the point of museums. I think about my own predilections towards things like institutional critique and inviting artists in and asking them to really not only serve the museum but be served by it. So I think that what we're seeing is actually, and museums have always been, I think it's actually a beautiful thing. They have been sort of reflections or responses or microcosms or ecologies that mirror parts of the world, and so that's a good thing. I have started asking my staff and my board and audiences what it looks like to have, and I don't know if Asa's here, but Asa came up with the answer. There's Asa. I said, what is a shape of a thing that looks the same on the outside and the inside? And he emailed me and said, a Klein bottle, which is absolutely right. And I was taken back to my Lacan days, which was terrific. But what does it look like to say, here's this thing? I think museums have been very good at projecting this integration into political issues without internally doing the work because it wasn't public facing. Right. We are now in a situation where we've rendered the vessel transparent, and it looks really different what the inside and the outside are doing. And so there's an aspiration, and I can talk about it more. I'm one of these people where I agree with Isolde. And I think for particular people also it's borderline problematic to say that these last 2 years have been really hard, because life's been really hard for a lot of people for a really long time, but we can get into that. But I think the last couple of years have allowed people like me who do respond to when really bad things happen in my life, I clean the house. Like, that's the thing I do, right? I scrub the bathroom.
That's not my reaction.
Okay. Right. But I think that you go into a mode where it's like, what can you fix? Right. And I'm not saying things are very bad, but I think why I like being a leader right now is the stuff that I think people don't like hearing about, like, do you do good interview process? What are your HR like all the stuff that doesn't sound like it's really exciting is kind of exciting right now. So I'm scrubbing the bathtub and also trying to do great programming.
what?
I was just going to say that I think museums, and I think we have to be direct about it, and I think you're right to say it is deeply problematic to say the last 2 years have been the crisis, right? It's been a crisis for a long time. I don't know what... Okay. But I will say just the structure of the art world, or I will speak specifically to the process of careers in museums, right? We know there have been barriers to equitable access, right? You've had to come from relative or extraordinary privilege to have even the opportunity to go get a graduate degree in the arts or start in these professions that pay so little and have access and comfort in the entrees of these echelons of wealth. We know this, and the disparities between those at the decision-making table on the board and those at these are the basics that we have to
So we've been talking about some general things, but I always say museum directors are like the mayors of the art world. Like they actually have to fix problems. They're not senators, they're mayors. So Isolde, maybe straight to you. What are the low-hanging fruits? I mean, we have talked about some big issues, but what are sort of day one things that you feel that in terms of immediate actions to close that perception gap and to sort of move things in the right directions, what are some most urgent tasks that you would mention?
Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of piggyback a little bit on what Johanna and Ali have said as well. I mean, I think, as you just sort of emphasized, like the last 2 years were difficult, but what we contended with in particular around, gender, race, class, issues that affect LGBTQIA+ communities, that's not new to a lot of us, right? We've been experiencing that for decades. So there were many of us that, while traumatized by the last, couple of years, were not surprised at all. And there are many of us, and I see a number of friends and colleagues in the audience that were sort of in a way cheering and sort of saying, oh my God, finally, right? Because I think in so many ways, I mean, we're talking about different museums as well. When we think about the history of museums coming out of the Enlightenment era, that's a whole different kind of structure. When we think about contemporary art museums, non-collecting museums, museums today that are set up to be responsive and to really sort of center and collaborate with artists to kind of, help them realize their vision, that's a whole other conversation. And I do think it's interesting, Johanna, when you talk about work, artists have always done the work, or at least the artists that I've worked with over the years, and that includes Jeffrey. I mean, I see a number of them in the audience. They've always done the work. I think the flip here, the pivot, is now artists have sort of said, we've been working, we're going to continue to work. You all now have to step up to the plate. The institution, the structure, we need seismic shifts, structural shifts, maybe even flat-out paradigm shifts. And for a lot of people, and again, a number of us have been waiting for this moment, but for a lot of people inside kind of museums, museum professionals, culture workers, what have you, it's a bit of like a shock, right? And maybe we see that, split across generational lines, but I just want to be really kind of clear on that, and I know that you emphasize that as well. Low-hanging fruit, I mean, for me, it's people over projects, people over profits. You have to start with the people when we're talking about these institutions, the people that make these, museums what they are. And those are the team members. Those are from the front of house staff, the security guards, to the curators that are working overtime, working with artists with minimal resources. And I'm, again, not singling out one particular museum, but so I've been really interested I've been doing a lot of listening, a lot of one-on-ones. I've already had 2 mini retreats. I have 4 departments that report into me, doing retreats with those departments to really whiteboard out. How do you see yourself? What is your role? How do you see your role? What's working? What isn't working? Are we talking timelines, workflow, all of that? Because that is really about the culture in which each team member comes to work to do the work. And if that culture isn't working, if it's broken, if it's problematic, and most of the time it is, right? I mean, I love that we're talking about reinventing the museum, and there's a part of me that's like, reinventing? I'm talking about dismantling and rebuilding, but not that that's going to happen. Yeah, no, it's more of a mentality, right? So for me, I'm really starting with the people and really trying to kind of collaboratively come up with, creative solutions and ideas about how to make their place better, right? So that they can kind of not only function, but really thrive. So that's really important to
Well,
me.
actually, I want, let's build on that just for a minute, because I was going to come back, but since you raised it, I mean, I think it's fair to say, maybe you'll disagree, is that actually for most visitors, you go through a museum today, I mean, there are great exhibitions to be had, great programs, great food, great experiences. I think what is rarely seen is the trouble behind the scenes, and that museums have been so devoted to putting that product out that many of the management 101s that are perfectly normal, frankly, in corporate America, haven't been followed. And there's a pay gap. There are the working conditions. If any of you have been behind the scenes in many museums, you'd be, surprised. The morale, the lack of attention to that morale. So I'm glad you're working on it. But one of the parts of it has been attracting the best talent. So other than the money, what is making it difficult to get people? Or maybe it's not difficult.
I think it's some of it, and
Yeah.
I'm sure, it has to do with the culture. I mean, I will tell you that there is no way I was going to step into a leadership role unless I really understood that I was set up for success, right? And too often than not, specifically with leadership candidates of color, with BIPOC candidates, we're asked to come in with our capes and do these rescue missions, but there's nothing there to ground us when we land, and usually the cape flies off, right? So, you can ask my wonderful, wonderful boss, Lisa Phillips. I mean, she had so much patience in that interview process because I came back with the most minute questions about everything because I wanted to make sure that not only was I going to land, but that I was going to be able to fly, right, in conversation with everybody. So retention is a huge thing, and we're seeing that now. People are literally, leaving jobs. I mean, we're talking about museums. I just think, generally speaking,
The great resignation.
and some of it has to do with culture, and also being very forward-thinking about the next generation. Yeah. I'm kind of in between old school and new school. The new school, which are the students that I teach at NYU, they flat out will tell you that whole grind thing that you do. That you all do, all that you old folks, we don't do that, right? We want to come to work 3 days a week.
Yeah.
We need a new laptop because the buttons have popped off the one that I have. I mean, they're very, however we want to generalize, millennial, Gen Z, they're very upfront and very clear, and yes, there's some issues with that about what they need to do their job. So I think that retention is tied to us being very forward-thinking. And just really quickly, to moving away from this mantra of if it ain't broke, then don't fix it. Yeah. Okay. And more into, if you do what you've always done, you're always going to get what you've always gotten, right?
So I want to go to the people outside the house, that audience that we've all been speaking about. Those of you who follow such things, you know that the LaPlaca-Cohen Culture Track survey is out. You have to be a bit of a wonk, but it's a big deal in our world. It's a wonderful report that gauges public sentiment on why people choose to go to art events. And one of the findings from this report, literally out this week, is they ask people, what are they missing from their lives? The number one category was fun, 54%. And then in roughly equal measure, calm, adventure, connection with others, and humor. So are museums delivering that? And should they? And how? Those things.
I think Allie should start with that
Allie,
one. I'm not really
You're going to deliver it all.
We're going to deliver it all. We're going to do it everything, and we're going to do it tomorrow. No, we're going to do it fast. Well, I've been saying for years, I think all of us probably have, that museums should not be a place just to walk in and stand at a quiet remove and look and be quiet and feel like you have to be cerebral. Sometimes they are for that, and some exhibitions or artist projects might offer that. They should be a place where you should be able to be free and feel joy and lie on the floor and look up if you want and yell to your friend if that's appropriate and laugh if that's what the spirit moves you to do. That's my hope. I think there is, again, this perception that it is this very serious, somewhat elitist experience that maybe isn't for you. We ask all the time, like, why can the general audiences of the world feel comfortable watching a movie and saying, I like this, I don't like that, but why can't they do that when they come into the museum? And there's this feeling of like, oh, maybe it isn't for me. So I think all of us need to do everything we can do to help undo that feeling. And yeah, that has to do with the things that we put into the museum and the artists that we work with, but it has everything to do with what you guys were both talking about as well, about taking education or engagement or public practice or whatever the different terminologies we want to use from the that partner with our curatorial initiatives and put those things deeply entwined together and make sure that everyone has access points and are welcomed into the institution, and it feels like this experience of to come in and laugh. And yes, it should be that, and how do we help make it that? We have teams and teams and teams of people working to make that happen and allow for less perhaps institutional voice and more individual voice from artists, from audiences, from team members, and that is really super
And it's
key.
not just that more fun is more fun, but some of those serious institutional messages were also exclusionary.
Perhaps, yeah.
So I would add, and I don't think that this is to in any way actually rub up against you, but to compliment you, which is that what I would, one reason I wanted to pause is fun is, one might want to unpack what that means.
Yeah.
So for me, fun is actually going into a space where I feel comfortable being uncomfortable often. Not that I'm necessarily reassured of my already standing beliefs, but that I'm asked questions that actually in various ways allow me to think differently or put something in front of me I haven't seen. I think what we're all saying, though, is how do you make a space that's safe for people to do that? And it has historically been the case that that's only a safe space for a certain very, very finite group of people. So I wouldn't want to lose the idea that institutions should actually be places where very difficult conversations can happen.
I totally agree.
We were just talking, actually, I was with Lisa, and we were talking about all of these more and more immersive, more and more, the kind of blurring we've seen for 20 years between entertainment and art. And I'm not saying it shouldn't and can't happen, but there does need to be, I think, an insistence that when we say fun or say pleasure, that might look really different for different people. My pleasure is, this is probably saying too much, but is often deeply uncomfortable. I really enjoy being put in a place where
We know how you deal with crisis.
Well, right, I know. I'm painting a great picture. But I do think the other thing I would say is that one reason I'm so glad to be at MOCA, and today's my 30-day anniversary, so just wanted to mention that, is that I think reinventing, particularly, we're all contemporary, which I find really interesting. I have been really excited that all of my new big ideas for MOCA are things that exist in the institution's history already. It was the Artist Museum. It should be the Artist Museum. What does that mean? But also not replicating the strategy, just going back and mining the DNA. So it's this question again of it should be open, it should be accessible, it should be all these things, but how does that question get asked today?
I'm so glad you said that, actually, because I think in some ways I agree. I don't think we're rubbing up against each other at all. And I agree that the answer can't be lean into spectacle and lean into this very cursory approach to fun. And I think perhaps the challenge is that museums must be, and I think all of us agree, a space to address really critical issues confronting the world, because that is the power of the artists and always has been. And for contemporary art in particular, that's the way for us to help ourselves, our audiences, navigate the world today.
And that's pleasure, right?
That is pleasure, and that's success.
Quick question. I just want to get a quick rough check. How many people think they might have a question? Okay. We'll get to that in a minute. But, just sticking on the audience for a second, obviously the big opening of this year has been about engaging the community, understanding where the sort of threshold resistance was high, and really opening up the museum. But there is another side to this, which is the fact that this country is incredibly polarized. So when you're saying creating this space where everybody can feel comfortable in a country that is so polarized, do you think museums are capable of engaging people across the spectrum in this moment?
So, is it okay if I start?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, this is the big one.
We're also, we need to, when we talk about communities, let's, speak in pluralities, right? But when we talk about museums, I think we need to do the same, because there's a big difference between the new museum in the city of New York on the Bowery and the Museum of Art in, Boise,
city.
Idaho,
Yeah,
right?
Anybody
And I
here
don't say
from
that in
Boise?
any kind of pejorative way. The key here is to know your audiences, plural. Not your audience, but your audiences, plural, right? And even at a place, like the New Museum, like MoMA, like Whitney, not to be US-centric, New York-centric, we're still learning, I think. We still have a ways to go to figure out who our audiences are, both core and also aspirational, right? So we're not going to be all things to all people, but we can, at the very least, glean a sense of the landscape around us and the communities that occupy that landscape, that reside within that landscape, and figure out how to kind of bring them in. And that involves both not only in-reach and outreach, right? I think a lot of it, and this isn't new, and I'm sure both of you will agree, begins with partnerships and alliances. And I actually think institutions probably need to do a little more of that as well. It's not just, I have my little space here in the city and, you're on your own because you're the Brooklyn Museum across the bridge, right? So I actually would love to see more alliances across institutions, but also more deep, meaningful partnerships within various communities, because that's the only way you're actually going to get to know the communities and the humans, right, that live there, and understand what kinds of points of entry might we create together that will encourage you, right, and excite you to come to the museum and not only engage but participate, right? And that's a very different conversation than our colleagues in Boise are having, right? Their communities look very different.
Yeah, that's true. Anyone else? Yeah.
I would just add, yes, everything you said, Isolde, and also that, again, this comes back to the question of what a museum's function is, and perhaps we can look historically and also at the moment that we're in and say, how far can we, so I've looked a lot at, and I'm not the first person to say this, how libraries have really changed. And they've become these civic, right? They've always been public, but now they're civic institutions. People don't just go to the library to check out a book. They eat and they watch movies and they have phone calls, and it's demographically so diverse that, and the city has to really kind of accommodate that, right? You've got folks who are there because they need to be warm, and then you have people who are bringing their kids in. Now, if we want that kind of space for the museum, and it's a question, I would say I do, but what do we actually have to offer to make that possible? And we don't offer those things.
Well, it's very interesting. I wrote a book last year about the future of museums and talking to a lot of museum directors and asked them, what are your models? And most frequently, they pointed to libraries. So what is it that structurally, physically, organizationally, museums have to undo to get to that success, to that porosity?
Well, they have to undo some of what libraries, frankly, had to undo. If you look at the history of architecture around libraries, there's a whole story of undoing all those big steps, and you look at the facades of libraries that for a series of time were putting barricades up where people couldn't sleep and couldn't sit and couldn't easily access up and in. So we need to think about the physical way you access in and the hours that you are open and the way that it's comfortable to just be and sit and what it's then like to walk through and who's watching you and what it feels like. And I think for those of us here, it can't just be us paying attention to this, but we have to empower all of our teams to say, what is the experience from the time you make the decision to go, and how do you even make the decision to go, and how do you know you have the right to make the decision to go to the museum, and what is that process from the minute you make that decision to how do you get there and know how to get there, and what is it like to go in, and every piece of that, I think, all of us and the teams and the people in this room need to think about what that looks like.
And that's why it's an exciting moment. Yep.
I was just going to say, I've made this argument for years. You can ask Lisa. IKEA has childcare.
Right.
But we don't have childcare at most museums. So there's really kind of a question of looking, as you say, at different institutional structures. Capitalism's mastered some of them.
One of my favorite things was just in the paper. A museum in Europe recently rehung their galleries. They said most of their visitors are kids. They're not hanging pictures at kids' eye level. It's a simple thing. All right, questions. A couple of questions. We had a few in the room over there, second row. And I think we have a roving microphone. And if possible, if you'd like, say who you are, but you don't have to. Actually, it was going to be up there, but all right, we'll start over there. Yeah. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Sandy Miller from San Francisco. A question I have, hi, Ellie, is the role of the new museums as you're envisioning it, and specifically contemporary art museums, with respect to galleries? There's always been a great tension, concerns, commercialism, etc. Yet the galleries often have a very special relationship with a lot of great emerging artists. Do you see it? Do you see there's been a lot of tension. Do you see the world changing in a way, and how might it change with respect to the relationship of museums like all yours with major galleries?
I can start it because Sandy and I talk a lot. I think one thing that we see happening sometimes, and maybe it's a response a little bit to something that goes on in San Francisco, where so much of I think really wonderful contemporary art and fast-moving contemporary art is coming out of some great galleries in the Bay Area. And I think there's always wonderful partnerships between galleries and contemporary art museums. The obvious difference is the difference in the relationship with the market, right? And that's our fundamental difference. And we have partnerships and relationships with galleries that are pretty tight in the sense that we all circulate in the same world and have good partnerships in terms of helping artists achieve what we all want to help them achieve, which is impact, visibility, access to new opportunities to have their voices heard. So I think those are really important partnerships, but I also think at the same time to keep those divisions of market relationships and goals of critical support versus kind of market and career support separate feels important.
Isolde?
No, I would love to hear. I think we have a couple more questions.
Yeah. There's a lady over there in the second row.
Someone have a mic back here? Yeah.
No.
Hi.
Sorry. Okay, you go ahead.
Hi, my name is Alex Deloach Davis. I manage marketing for the High Museum of Art in Atlanta.
Hi
And
there.
I thank you for this. I'm really enjoying this conversation. One thing I wanted to ask you guys is you talked about audiences, you talked about workers and cultural workers and how to affect change amongst those groups, but I wanted to ask about leadership, board leadership, and how you are looking at affecting change and pipelining new leaders to be on boards, and what you feel like your role is in that as directors.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. Thank you, and welcome from Atlanta, one of my favorite museums, the High. That's top of mind, I think, not only for us at the new museum, I think for all of us. One of the things that I'm part of, or I was part of a group of Black museum trustees across the country. One of the things I think that's come up for a lot of us is that the boards, number one, they're very homogeneous, and they're also, the age skews, sort of up 60, 65 and up. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't leave us in a very good place in about 10 years, right? So there are a couple things here. Thinking about bringing on younger board members, and then for us and for me, thinking about, in particular, diversifying boards and specifically bringing on Black, Latinx, and Indigenous board members. And that's, that involves, again, I think, a big paradigm shift. When you're talking specifically, say, about Black board members, and again, I'm not at all intending to generalize, we have to have a very uncomfortable, speaking of getting comfortable with discomfort, which is one of my favorite mottos, uncomfortable conversation about wealth and about money, right? And thinking generationally about, I use myself as an example. I do not come from a significant amount of wealth, right? I am doing fairly well, but it's my daughter and her generation that will actually begin to benefit and be able to build wealth, where she will have some additional money to decide what to do in terms of philanthropic endeavors and so on and so forth. And that's not, again, generalizing. There's wealth in multiple communities. But what it does then is ask us at the kind of senior leadership level and in terms of museum boards to think about the board structure, to think about buy-in. What are we asking people to put up, right? If we want that young African-American woman who is a founder in tech, right, but is just beginning to build wealth, are we going to ask her? And again, it becomes a very difficult conversation to have across board members to put up the $50,000 that we ask other people who maybe are in their 70s or come from different, So there's no one answer, but these are very difficult but necessary conversations to have. The other thing I think too is thinking about artists on board. I mean, the whole reason I'm sitting here is because of artists and the art they make. That's it. That's the main reason I'm here. So when we're talking about boards who make decisions, who are in nominating and gatekeeping kind of positions, I think we need to start also thinking more inclusively about roles for artists. I've heard conversations amongst my peers at different institutions talking about, what about a kind of a community role or a role for a community member, right? So it's not answering all of your question, but it's really teasing out some of the kind of critical issues that I think a lot of us are beginning to really discuss at the board level, because boards are changing, and they have to change. Yeah. And the question is really like, how, right?
I don't have anything brilliant to add other than to just say that this is the perhaps most top of mind issue that I need my peers to tease out with me.
Lady in the second row. And by the way, we have Jeffrey Gibson here with us, who is on the board of the museum in Brooklyn. So thank you for your service.
So I hope it's, I can leave it on? You'll be able to hear me? Anyhow, I'm going to read this question because I'm the editor of Art News magazine, and it's much easier for me to read something I've
it's
written.
Sarah. Okay.
Because it's me. I just saw you this morning.
Yeah,
You've forgotten
the
so
bright
soon.
lights.
You don't remember this great dress? Anyhow. So this is a question that I've actually been thinking about for a while now, this question of it, in new leaders at institutions. And I had a long conversation with a former director who happens to be a woman. And anyhow, so I'm just going to kind of read this, and I want to go back to something that Johanna said about a low-key role. I think that's really interesting. So what I wrote down is, if you go back and look at articles in places like the New York Times, the role of a museum director was being called an impossible job. I'm talking about U.S. museums as early as the late 1980s. The issues until recently, broadly speaking, were the challenges of fundraising and the need to be equal parts a business person, lessening the chance that directors would be able to rise through the curatorial ranks, and hence programs like the Center for Curatorial Leadership, which taught, and still does, teaches curators business skills to grow into these director roles. So is this issue of staff or team, as Isolde said, the idea of gaining the implicit trust of staff, because what we've seen is that a single social media post from a staff member at a lower ranking level can bring low a large institution. So I'm getting to this in a roundabout way, but I'm wondering if you can expand on that idea of a low-key role as opposed to the image of a museum director until recently was, I think, of someone who was in a sort of elite, removed position, dealing with sort of board members and other similarly wealthy individuals who would potentially be sources of funds for the museum. And I'm just going to go ahead and say, something that I think codes male. And I wondered if we're entering a new era of perhaps the low-key director.
God, I hope
guess
so.
Do you want to
Sorry about that.
No. Thank you for the question. I've thought about this a lot, in part because it's just how I've worked. I've worked with teams. As somebody who came out of education, that's how you worked. And it was ideological, but it was also practical, right? You have a bunch of people with a bunch of amazing skill sets who want to support an artist who is the visible. And what's so amazing to me is the satisfaction that comes out of that work is personal, but it's also about you're mentoring people. You're also learning in real time. I have found that what's so satisfying about, and again, I'm only 30 days in, but I'm on a listening tour too, and I feel like I've already had to kind of dislodge some habits I didn't even know I had, right? Because you end up talking about these things. I should also say low-key is a lot of work. I want to make, it's not like casual or something. By low-key, I simply mean that I've observed women leaders. I think there is a gendering here that for better and for worse, that disappear when the machine's really humming. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. I don't think that means I can't stand up and give a really powerful speech or inspire a vision, but the vision isn't about me. The vision is about the platform and the institution and what that place needs at any given moment. And that when I leave structures intact that somebody else can come in and change, but they're working. And those structures are built by teams who believe in the work, who identify with the work, and to your point, can maybe have a complaint or can be really angry about something, but can come and talk to you, right, about it. And it doesn't need to be escalated to something that's public that then becomes untenable and toxic, frankly. So my first 30 days, I'm looking at the people on staff here, I've done my very, very best to, and I haven't gotten there fully, but meet with every single staff member and to continue having those conversations. It's really hard to balance that and then doing the out in the world work. It becomes two jobs. I don't know if that answers your question, but I believe in this very, very, very strongly, and that this is a way that I think new institutions will be run, and I think that people will be looking for it.
And I'm going to have to close us down now, but not before asking a last question. And just, okay, you had your hand up at the beginning, so sorry. One more question then, quickly.
Well, grab the mic, I think that's great.
Thank you so much. Yeah. My name is Zanette, I'm from London. I have a question. How do you plan to close the gap or build the bridge between museums becoming more accessible to kind of a wider audience for everyone, as it was mentioned before, and for people who, in a more traditional sense, search for deeper knowledge and more meaningful content? Specifically, for example, I'm referring to a recent exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and it was called Handbags Inside Out, and to me it was purely tragic. I don't want to go to a museum of such scale to look at, content that I have in my wardrobe. I want to seek knowledge, I want to seek deeper understanding, but I do equally understand how perhaps handbags are very Instagrammable and create social content for the museums, and hence traffic and attention, etc. So it is, yes, so how would you perhaps comment on that bridge? Thank you very much.
I think it's a misperception, perhaps, that there has to be a split between broad audience accessibility and serious access to complicated topics. And I think it's everyone's job at the museum and artists' jobs to navigate that path.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. I think we can talk about inclusivity and accessibility, but also engage with, very meaningful, substantive ideas and content. I think that's where your team comes in, and that's where the collaborations with artists come in. How do you create those different entry points? At the end of the day, we're not going to please everybody all the time. A museum is going to do 8 exhibitions a year. There may be 2 or 3 that don't float your boat, and some of that is just the reality. But I think it really comes down to working with artists, working with the teams on hand to create multiple entry points, so that if it is a handbag exhibition and there is a fashion historian who can speak in a different kind of context about what it is you're looking at, that opens the door for some people. And then, there's a conversation with influencers about the significance of, a particular handbag over the last 10 years. I think you can have all of that kind of programming, and that opens it up to everybody, right?
All right.
Can I just say one thing?
Please.
This has become the Jeffrey Gibson show, but I do feel like
sorry, Jeffrey,
I just want to say, for instance, when everyone here has worked with Jeffrey, so that's also kind of fun. When we did our project, you brought in a fashion historian actually to talk around some of these issues. So I think it's really key. I think it's a really good question, which is sometimes it's not the content, it's the framing, and it's how an artist or curator or community group really kind of thinks about how to bring that in. So I just wanted to say, and lots of pleasure Jeff asks really, really hard questions with a lot of joy. So
All right,
that was a really good question.
So everyone, we're going to have to bring this party to an end, this joyful
party.
conclave. But not before my last question. And I had two last questions prepared, but I'm tossing them out because I want to come back to this issue of stepping into leadership role. I'm acutely aware that there are three incredible women here. I'm like the one guy up here. And I know that you're all mentors as well to the next generation. But you have found a path into this, which none of it started with like, I wanted to be a museum director, you know. It's been circuitous, fortuitous. What do you say to your daughter's generation, your kids' generation, who want to be intentional about taking this kind of role? How should they go about it? What are the qualities they should have, or what is the path they should take, or how should they prepare? So I'm curious as a closing question from each of you. And we'll start over there, because...
We all have kids.
We do all have kids.
And we all have a daughter and a son. I will say to my children, I'll speak just to my children, I would want, or am I speaking to people who want to be museum directors?
Yes.
Oh, I'm speaking to, this is not my children, by the way.
Yes, they all want to be
Children
bankers.
They would rebel. They do not want to go see a museum. I think you want to think about, I wish someone had said, my great mentors, and I have so many wonderful ones, really like, what does it mean to choose happiness for yourself in your life, right? I have taken a very circuitous path where in many instances I chose some positions that were kind of steps up, and I was wooed and people threw opportunities at me, and they weren't always the right decision for my family. They weren't always the right decision for me. It all has worked out pretty well, and I feel largely happy in my life, which is good news. But I wish that there had been some sort of help to step back and say, you know what? What does it look like to have a more purely balanced life? It's okay to go a little bit slower and have some real choices about saying, like, I don't think this is working in this institution. I don't feel happy. Maybe it's okay to speak up and say, I don't feel happy here. And I think that it's perhaps particularly for women coming up in the art world, there was a little bit of a, you're lucky to be in this job, grin and bear it and do the grind and all the stuff that I think the generation coming after me is much, much better at saying, this doesn't work for me. So I would say own that piece and also choose happiness for yourself personally.
Isolde.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, you know me, happiness and joy all the way. I was going to say the same thing. I mean, for me, I have an 11-year-old going on 30. It's completely about her kind of being joyful, her knowing that she's enough, and her also knowing her truth. I mean, I look out here, I see mentors, but I also see some of mentees. I have always hired young women, and specifically young women of color. And, you know, it's really interesting as we look forward to these other generations. I kind of use this model of the generation who laid the path that I'm walking on fought really, really hard to get in the box. And then once we got in the box, we fought really, really hard to be able to sort of think outside the box. Mm-hmm. This generation coming up does not see a box. Mm-hmm. And I really, really encourage that. They are comfortable sitting in different spaces. They are comfortable blurring boundaries, don't see boundaries. So know your truth, and don't necessarily feel like you need to be respectful, right, and acknowledge from whence we came, but don't necessarily feel like you have to operate within these sort of prescribed confines.
Johanna,
and you do need to eat your vegetables.
Johanna, your advice to the next generation.
I would say, and this may be true for you too as well, I was trained to, it was dog eat dog, it was competitive. I feel this new generation, and I align with it, it's we rise together. I think I was taught in many ways that if there was distributed power, you got less of it. I think we need to train people to understand that distributed power makes everybody more powerful, including the person who's willing to share it. So I would say for folks in the room, find your friends and hold on to them really tight. And also don't ever discount anybody, because in 10 years, I said this last night, they'll be your boss.
They'll be your boss.
They'll be your boss.
Yes.
Well, everybody, I think we can all agree that there's a very long to-do list for museums to go down, but I think after this we can all agree that with colleagues like this at the helm, the future of museums is very bright. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres.
Thank you.